Some stories find us when we need them most. This one came from the old cattle country of Montana, passed down by folks who swore every word was true. It tells of a cowboy named Silas, a man who had built walls around his heart so high he forgot there was anything worth protecting inside. And it tells of a young woman named Faith, who traveled 2,000 miles on a promise that turned out to be smoke. In the 1880s, mail-order brides were common enough. Most found nervous husbands waiting at the depot with wildflowers and trembling hands. Faith found an empty platform and 3 days of walking through country that did not care whether she lived or died. What happened next changed 2 lives forever. Rain hammered the valley so hard Silas could barely see his horse's ears. Then he saw her, a shape huddled by the roadside, small against the storm. He pulled the reins and squinted through sheets of water. A woman, young, her dress clung to her frame, mud caking the hem past her knees. Her lips were cracked and white. Her shoes had worn through at the soles. He could see bare skin where leather should have been. She moved like someone whose body had given up days ago, but whose mind refused to follow. Both hands gripped a leather valise, knuckles bone-white, fingers trembling. She looked up. Brown eyes met his, red-rimmed, dry. "Where you headed?" His voice came out rough. She stared at him. Rain streamed down her face like tears she had forgotten how to cry. "I don't know anymore." Silas glanced toward town, 5 miles of mud, then back at his cabin, 1 mile. He reached down his hand. They say kindness can find us on the loneliest roads, often wearing a muddy hat and few words. From the numbers we have seen, many of you watching have not yet subscribed. If this story has touched your heart, we would be grateful if you would subscribe and help us bring more tales like this one to life. Thank you kindly, friends. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and neglect. Silas fed kindling into the cast-iron stove, blowing until flames caught and crackled. Behind him, the woman stood dripping on his floor, arms wrapped around herself. That valise still clutched against her ribs. Dishes crusted with old beans filled the wash basin. Shirts hung from chair backs. Dust furred the windowsills, thick as moss. He had not cleaned in months, maybe longer. He grabbed a wool blanket from the back room and held it out without looking at her face. "Get warm." She took it. Her fingers brushed his, cold as creek stones. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove, black, bitter, strong enough to strip paint. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup, and he saw them trembling, not from the chill. She sat on the stool nearest the fire. Steam rose from her dress. The room filled with the smell of wet wool and mud, and something faintly like lavender. "Ohio." Her voice came flat, hollow. "My folks died when I was 17. Scarlet fever took them both in the same week." Silas lowered himself into the chair across from her, said nothing. "I worked at a sewing factory, 12 hours a day. Then I saw the advertisement." She stared into the fire. Montana rancher, seeking wife, hard-working and sincere. The flames popped. A log shifted. "We wrote letters for 3 months. He said he would meet me at the Willow Creek Depot. Said he would be wearing a blue kerchief." She paused. "I sold everything I owned for the train ticket. There was no going back." Her hands tightened around the cup. "I waited 2 days at the depot, slept on a bench. Then I started walking, asked for water at 2 homesteads along the way. One woman gave me a bit of bread." She touched her cracked lips. 40 miles, 3 days. She reached down and unlatched the valise. Inside, a stack of letters tied with kitchen string. She lifted them out. The paper had gone soft, ink bleeding where the rain had soaked through. His name was James Hollister. He said he had a ranch east of town. Silas went still. His throat tightened. James Hollister ran the mercantile in Willow Creek. He had a wife named Eleanor, 2 children, a house with a white fence. He had no ranch. James Hollister. Silas stared at the fire. His jaw tightened. He could not look at her face. James Hollister had run the mercantile in Willow Creek for 6 years. Silas bought grain and salt from him every spring. The man had a wife, 2 children, a house with a white fence and roses climbing the porch rail. The letters in Faith's lap made a different kind of sense now. The cruelty of it pressed against his ribs like a stone. "You know him?" Her voice came quiet. Not a question. Silas nodded once. "He's got a family. Wife named Eleanor. A boy and a girl." Silence filled the cabin. The fire crackled. Bam Bam drummed steady on the roof. Faith's hands went still on the letters. Her jaw tightened. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stared into the flames with the look of someone watching everything they believed turn to ash. Then she stood, crossed to the stove, and fed the letters into the fire one by one. Paper curled, ink blackened. 3 months of promises vanished in seconds. "You can stay," Silas said. "Long as you need." She did not answer. She just watched the last letter burn. Faith slept for most of the next day. Silas checked on her twice, once in the morning when the sun came through the window, once in the afternoon when the shadows grew long. Both times she lay curled on the narrow bed in the spare room, the wool blanket pulled to her chin, her breathing deep and even. Her body was paying the debt of 40 miles. He left a cup of water on the small table beside the bed, left a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. When he checked again at dusk, both were gone. She did not come out until the following morning. The smell of cornbread woke him. Silas blinked at the ceiling, confused. He had not smelled cornbread since his mother passed. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, thought he was 12 again, waking to her humming in the kitchen. Then he remembered. He pulled on his boots and walked out of the back room. Faith stood at the stove, her hair pinned up in a tight knot, an old apron tied around her waist. The table gleamed. Dishes that had sat crusted in the basin for weeks now stood clean and stacked on the shelf. She did not turn around. "I don't take charity," she said. "I work for my keep." Silas stood in the doorway, hands hanging at his sides. He did not know what to do with them, did not know what to say. So he sat at the table and ate the cornbread without a word. It tasted like memory. On the 5th day, she found his torn shirts. Silas came in from the barn to find her sitting by the window, needle flashing in the afternoon light. A pile of his work clothes lay folded beside her, the ones with ripped elbows, the ones with missing buttons, the ones he had shoved in a corner and forgotten. "These aren't fit for rags," she said without looking up. "When did you last mend anything?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Don't recall." Her fingers moved quick and sure, pulling thread through fabric in neat, even stitches. Sunlight caught the side of her face, turned her hair copper where it escaped the pins. Silas's throat went tight. His mother used to sit in that same spot, same light, same angle, same quiet concentration. She would hum while she worked old hymns, half-remembered tunes from her girlhood back east. Faith did not hum, but her hands moved the same way, patient, certain, like mending was a kind of prayer. Silas went back outside and busied himself braiding rope on the porch. His fingers worked the leather strips harder than necessary. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the window. He could see her through the glass. The way she tilted her head, the way she bit her lower lip when the thread tangled. He pulled the braid so tight his knuckles went white. On the 10th morning, Faith looked up from her breakfast. "Mr. Silas, could I plant some flowers by the porch steps?" He paused, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. No one had asked him for anything in years. The question sat strange in the air, like a word from a language he had forgotten. "Plant what you want," he said. That afternoon he watched her from the fence line. She knelt in the dirt with his old hand spade, digging holes along the porch rail. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. Soil darkened her fingers. She worked with the focus of someone building something that mattered. Silas told himself he was fixing the fence post. He was not watching her. He was not counting the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear every few minutes. He was not memorizing the line of her shoulders against the afternoon sun. 20 steps away, close enough to hear her humming, soft and low, barely audible, far enough to pretend he did not notice. She looked up once, caught him staring. He looked away fast, hammer swinging down on a nail that did not need hitting. When he glanced back, she was smiling. Just barely, just at the corners of her mouth. She knew. That night, Faith did something that made Silas go still. She lifted the valise, the same one she had clutched like salvation on the roadside, and carried it to the corner of the front room. She set it down against the wall, pushed it back with her foot until it sat flush against the baseboard. The valise had not left her side since she arrived. She had kept it by her bed, by her feet at meals, within arm's reach every waking moment. Now it sat in the corner, closed, still. She did not look at Silas, but she spoke loud enough for him to hear from the kitchen doorway. "I'm tired of carrying it everywhere." Silas said nothing. He understood. The valise held everything she owned, everything she had brought from Ohio, everything she had left of the life she thought she was coming to. And now she was putting it down. He turned back to the stove and poured himself more coffee. His hand trembled slightly. He told himself it was the heat from the pot. Outside, the last light faded over the valley. Crickets started their evening song. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and fell silent. Faith washed the supper dishes. The soft clink of plates and the slosh of water filled the space between them. It was not uncomfortable anymore. The quiet had changed. It felt less like absence and more like agreement. Two strangers learning not to bump into each other in a small space. Silas stood at the window, watching the darkness settle. The cabin had stopped feeling empty, and that thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He glanced toward town, toward Willow Creek, toward James Hollister and his white fence and his lies, and wondered how long before someone started asking questions about the woman living in his cabin. 2 weeks since the rain, 2 weeks since Silas found her on the road. The buckboard rattled over ruts in the dried mud, wheels creaking with each jolt. Silas held the reins loose, letting the horse find its own pace. Beside him, Faith sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingers twisting a cotton handkerchief into knots. He noticed the tremor in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the horizon where Willow Creek waited. "Ain't nobody gonna bite you," he said. She tried to smile. It did not reach her eyes. Her lips pressed thin. and she went back to strangling the handkerchief. The road stretched ahead, 5 miles of dust and sage. Silas had made this trip 100 times, never thought twice about it, but today the distance felt longer. Today he was bringing someone with him, someone the town did not know, someone they would talk about. Faith had asked to come. She wanted to mail a letter to a friend back in Ohio, a woman named Clara, who had worked beside her in the factory. The only person, she said, who might wonder what happened to her. Silas had not argued. She needed to get out, needed to see something beyond the cabin walls and the fence posts and his silent company. But watching her now, watching the way her knuckles whitened around that scrap of cloth, he wondered if he should have said no. The town appeared slowly. First the church steeple, white against the blue sky, then the cluster of buildings along the main street, the general store, the saloon, the bank with its brick facade and iron-barred windows, a handful of horses tied to posts, tails flicking at flies. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop outside the general store. He climbed down and offered Faith his hand. She took at her palm, cool and dry despite the heat, and stepped onto the boardwalk. Martha Perkins ran the store, had run it for 20 years, ever since her husband passed from a fever that swept through the valley. She knew everyone's business, made it her mission to know. Silas had learned long ago to buy what he needed and leave fast. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Martha stood behind the counter, deep in conversation with 2 other women, the blacksmith's wife and the preacher's sister. All 3 looked up at the sound. The talking stopped. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on Faith, traveled from her face to her dress to her shoes and back again. The silence stretched. 3 seconds, 4, 5. Martha recovered first. She set down the bolt of calico she had been showing and planted both hands on the counter. Well, Silas. Her voice carried a sweetness that did not match her eyes. Long time since you graced us with a visit. Her gaze slid to Faith. And who might this be? Silas felt his neck go hot. He scratched at the back of it, a habit he could not break when caught off guard. This is Faith. She's helping out at my place. Helping out, Martha repeated the words slowly. Tasting them, her eyes never left Faith. I see. The blacksmith's wife leaned toward the preacher's sister, whispered something behind her hand. The preacher's sister pressed her lips together, fighting a smile that held no warmth. Faith stood perfectly still, her spine straightened, her chin lifted. She looked directly at Martha and nodded once, a small, precise movement, like a lady acknowledging a servant. Good morning, ma'am. Martha blinked. Whatever she had expected, it was not that. Good morning. The words came out flat. Silas moved toward the back of the store where the feed sacks were stacked. He needed grain for the horses, salt for the smokehouse, kerosene for the lamps. Simple things. Quick purchases. Get in, get out. But he could feel the weight of attention pressing against his back, could hear the shuffle of feet as the women repositioned themselves for a better view. Faith walked to the counter with the letter in her hand. I need to post this to Ohio. Please. Martha took the envelope, examined the address longer than necessary, then set it in the mail basket without a word. She named a price. Faith counted out coins from a small purse, a few pennies Silas had given her that morning, though she had protested until he called it a loan. The transaction completed in silence. Silas gathered his supplies, paid, and guided Faith toward the door. His hand hovered near the small of her back but did not touch. He could feel the stairs following them. could almost hear the thoughts forming behind those watching eyes. The bell jingled again as they stepped outside. The boardwalk seemed too bright after the dim interior. Silas squinted against the sun, loading the feed sacks into the buckboard. Faith stood beside the wheel, waiting, her face carefully blank. Then he heard it, voices drifting through the open window of the store. Martha's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry. "Mail order bride. I heard. Got left at the depot like unwanted baggage." Another voice, higher and sharper. "Living with Silas now. Alone in that cabin. You know what folks will think." Laughter. Low and knowing. "Never trusted that man. Keeps to himself too much. And now this." Faith's shoulders went rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, but she did not turn around, did not acknowledge that she had heard. She simply walked to the buckboard, climbed onto the seat, and folded her hands in her lap. Silas climbed up beside her, took the reins, said nothing. They rode in silence. 1 mile, 2. The town shrank behind them, swallowed by distance and dust. 3 miles, 4. Faith stared straight ahead. Her jaw was set so tight Silas could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin of her cheek. The handkerchief in her lap had been twisted into a rope. 5 miles. The cabin appeared on the horizon. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop by the porch. The horse snorted and stamped, eager for water. He sat there a moment, hands resting on his knees. "Folks talk," he said finally. "Don't mean nothing?" Faith turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry, her voice steady. "They think I'm a fallen woman, living in sin with a stranger." She spoke the words without flinching. "That's what they think." Silas met her gaze. "I know what they think. Don't change what's true." She had studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she was searching for, she seemed to find it. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not explaining, for not defending, for just letting me stand there and hold my own ground." He nodded. Words had never been his strength, but she understood anyway. They unloaded the supplies in silence. Faith carried the smaller packages inside while Silas handled the feed sacks. The rhythm of work settled between them, comfortable and familiar. But as Silas stacked the last sack in the barn, he could not shake the feeling that had taken root in his gut. The town knew about Faith now. The whispers had started, and whispers in a small town had a way of growing into something worse. He thought about Martha's eyes, the way they had narrowed when Faith lifted her chin and met her stare. That was not the look of idle curiosity. That was the look of a woman who had been challenged. Martha Perkins did not forget, and she did not forgive easily. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers and walked back toward the cabin. Faith stood on the porch, looking out at the valley, the evening light turning her hair to copper. She did not know what she had started today, did not know how deep the roots of small-town pride could run. But Silas knew. He had lived here his whole life, and he knew that the real trouble had not even begun. 7 days after the trip to town, the sound of hooves on packed dirt pulled Silas from the barn. He set down the pitchfork and walked toward the fence, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. A rider approached. Old Wilbur, the mail carrier, gray beard, stooped shoulders, a man who had been delivering letters and packages across this valley for 30 years. He rarely stopped at Silas' place. There was never anything to deliver. Silas leaned against the fence post and waited. Wilbur reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat. His eyes moved past Silas, toward the cabin, where Faith stood on the porch with a broom in her hands. "Morning, Silas." "Wilbur." The old man did not dismount. He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking beneath him. His gaze kept drifting back to Faith. "Figured you ought to know. Bank got robbed last night." Silas straightened. "The Willow Creek Bank." "Only one we got." Wilbur spat into the dust. $3,200. Cleaned out the safe and disappeared before dawn. Nobody hurt. But folks are riled up something fierce. Faith had stopped sweeping. She stood motionless on the porch, the broom held loose in her grip. Wilbur noticed. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long. Then he looked back at Silas with an expression that was hard to read. "Sheriff's asking question. Talking to everyone who came through town in the past couple weeks." He paused. "Just thought you should know." "Appreciate it." Wilbur nodded once, tugged the reins, and turned his horse back toward the road, but before he kicked into a trot, he glanced over his shoulder one more time at Faith. Silas watched him ride away until the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded into silence. His hands had curled into fists at his sides without him noticing. He walked back toward the cabin. Faith met him at the porch steps, the broom forgotten against the railing. What was that about bank robbery last night? Her face did not change. She simply nodded, the way someone nods at news of distant weather. "Anyone hurt?" "No." "Good." She picked up the broom and went back to sweeping. The bristles scratched against the wooden boards in a steady rhythm. Silas stood there a moment longer, watching the careful way she moved, the way her shoulders stayed loose and relaxed. Nothing in her posture suggested fear. Nothing suggested guilt. Just a woman doing her morning chores. But Wilbur's look stayed with him. That sideways glance, the way his eyes had measured Faith from a distance, calculating something. Silas had seen that look before, on faces in crowds, on juries, on men who had already made up their minds. He pushed the thought away and went back to the barn. The horse needed medicine, a stone bruise on the left front hoof that had turned septic. Silas could smell the infection when he lifted the foot, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. He needed to go to town, needed the powder that Doc Miller kept behind his counter. There was no avoiding it. "I'll be back before dark," he told Faith. "Keep the doors latched." She looked up from the stove where she was stirring a pot of beans. "Should I be worried?" "No." He said it too fast. They both knew it. The ride to Willow Creek took an hour. The sun climbed high and hot, baking the dust into a fine powder that coated his throat with every breath. Silas pulled his hat low and kept his eyes on the road. The town buzzed with activity. More horses than usual tied to the posts, more people on the boardwalks, gathered in clusters, voices low and urgent. Silas saw Sheriff Harlan standing outside the bank, talking to a group of men. The bank's front window had been boarded up where it had been smashed in. He avoided the main street, took the back way to Doc Miller's place, got the medicine, paid God without small talk. Then he made the mistake of passing by the saloon. Pete Tucker stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the street. When he saw Silas, his face changed. Something flickered in his eyes, concern. Maybe, or warning. "Silas, come here a minute." Silas tied his horse to the post and stepped onto the boardwalk. Pete grabbed his elbow and pulled him inside, away from the windows. The saloon was nearly empty. Too early for the regular drinkers. Just an old man asleep in the corner and the bartender wiping glasses behind the counter. Pete leaned close. His breath smelled of tobacco and coffee. "I'm telling you this because we go back, as your daddy helped mine when the drought hit in '62. He glanced toward the door, then back. Old Jenkins is running his mouth all over town. Silas's jaw tightened. Jenkins says he saw a woman with brown hair talking to some strangers outside town. Night before the robbery. Pete's voice dropped even lower. Says it was the girl staying at your place. The air in the saloon seemed to thicken. Silas felt his fingers curl around the edge of the bar. The wood bit into his palms. Jenkins can't see past his own nose. Last month he thought his barn cat was a skunk. Pete shrugged. I know that. You know that. But folks are scared. Silas, scared people don't think straight. He straightened up and stepped back. Martha's been talking too, spreading the story to anyone who'll listen. Says the girl showed up out of nowhere. No references. Says it's mighty convenient timing. Silas's knuckles went white against the bar. I'm just telling you what I hear, Pete said. Figured you'd want to know before it gets worse. Appreciate it. He walked out of the saloon without looking back. Mounted his horse. Rode out of town at a pace just slow enough to avoid drawing attention. The medicine bottle pressed against his thigh through the saddlebag. The horse's hooves struck the ground in a steady rhythm. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3. Jenkins. The name turned over in his mind like a stone in a creek. Ezra Jenkins. 70 years old, half blind. A man who had accused his own nephew of stealing chickens that had simply wandered into the neighbor's yard. His word meant nothing. Everyone knew that. But everyone also knew that rumors did not need truth to spread. They only needed fear. Faith had supper waiting when he returned. The cabin smelled of beans and cornbread and coffee. She had set the table with the good plates, the ones with the blue flowers that his mother had brought from back east. A single candle flickered in the center, casting soft shadows across the walls. Silas stood in the doorway, the medicine bottle still in his hand. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to. She pulled out his chair and gestured for him to sit. You looked troubled this morning. Thought a proper meal might help. He sat. She served. The beans were seasoned with salt pork and molasses. The cornbread was golden and crisp at the edges. She poured coffee into his cup, black, the way he liked it, and then settled into the chair across from him. They ate in silence. Silas watched her over the rim of his cup, the way she cut her cornbread into small, precise squares, the way she wiped her mouth with the corner of her napkin after each bite, the way her hands moved steady, unhurried, deliberate. Did bank robbers cut cornbread like that? He felt foolish for even thinking it. This woman had walked 40 miles through rough country with nothing but a valise and a handful of broken promises. She had scrubbed his cabin clean, mended his clothes, planted flowers in dirt that had seen nothing but weeds for years. She was not a thief. She was not a criminal. But the doubt was there, a splinter beneath the skin, tiny, invisible, impossible to ignore. After supper, Faith washed the dishes while Silas sat on the porch. The sun had dropped below the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Crickets tuned up in the grass. A cool breeze carried the smell of sage and coming rain. He heard her moving inside, the soft clink of plates, the slosh of water, the creak of the floorboards as she crossed to the window, then the scratch of a match, the warm glow of the kerosene lamp flaring to life. Silas turned and looked through the window. Faith stood with the lamp in her hands, adjusting the wick. The flame caught and steadied, casting gold light across her face. Her expression was calm, peaceful. The expression of someone with nothing to hide. His mother used to light the lamp the same way. Every evening, just after sunset, she would stand in that same spot, by that same window, and the light would spill out into the darkness like a silent welcome. Home, safety, peace. Faith set the lamp on the table and turned away. She did not know he was watching. Silas turned back toward the valley. The last light was fading fast. Stars were beginning to prick through the darkening sky. He believed her. He did. But the question that had lodged in his mind refused to leave. Did he trust her because she deserved it or because he needed to? Sunday morning. The church bell rang across the valley, its sound carrying clear and sharp in the still air. Faith stood at the window, watching the road that led toward town. She wore her best dress, the dark blue calico she had brought from Ohio, pressed and mended at the cuffs. Her hair was pinned back tight, not a strand out of place. "I want to go to church," she said. Silas looked up from his coffee. He had been hoping she would not ask, had been dreading this moment since the trip to town, since Wilbur's sideways glances, since Pete's warning in the saloon. "I reckon that's your call." She turned from the window. Her chin was set at that angle he had come to recognize, the one that meant she had made up her mind and nothing would change it. "Will you take me?" He drained the last of his coffee and reached for his hat. The ride took 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke. The buckboard wheels creaked over dried ruts and loose stones. Dust rose in lazy spirals behind them, hanging in the warm air before settling back to earth. The church appeared around the final bend, white-clappered walls. A simple steeple. A bell tower with a cross on top. Horses and wagons crowded the yard. Families in their Sunday best climbed the wooden steps and disappeared through the open doors. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop at the far edge of the yard, away from the other vehicles. He helped Faith down, and they walked toward the church side by side. People noticed. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes tracked their progress across the dusty yard with the focused attention of hawks watching mice. They climbed the steps. The doors stood open, letting out the sound of the congregation settling into pews, the rustle of skirts and hymnals and whispered greetings. Then they crossed the threshold. The singing stopped, not gradually, not naturally, the way a hymn might fade at the end of a verse. It stopped all at once, as if someone had pinched the sound off at its source. Silas felt the silence press against his skin. Every face in the church turned toward them. 40 pairs of eyes, 50, more than he had ever seen in this building on an ordinary Sunday. They had come to watch. The preacher stood at the pulpit, hymnal open in his hands. He was a thin man with gray hair and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. His eyes met Silas's across the rows of pews. He nodded once, a small, careful movement, acknowledgement without welcome. No one else moved. Faith walked down the center aisle with her spine straight and her eyes forward. Silas followed one step behind, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, far enough to give her room to breathe. They slid into the last pew. The wood was hard and cold beneath them. The hymnal rack in front of them held a single worn book, its cover faded to the color of old bone. The preacher cleared his throat. "Let us continue with hymn 47. The singing resumed, thin and hesitant at first, then gathering strength as voices found their rhythm again. But Silas could feel the attention still fixed on the back of the church, could feel the weight of it pressing against his shoulders. Faith opened the hymnal and found the page. Her lips moved with the words, but no sound came out. The service dragged on. Scripture readings. A sermon about forgiveness that felt pointed, though Silas could not say exactly how. Prayers spoken in the preacher's reedy voice while heads bowed and eyes remained open. Stealing glances toward the last pew. When the final amen was spoken, the congregation rose, families gathered their belongings and moved toward the doors. Children were collected and scolded and herded toward waiting wagons. No one approached the last pew. No one extended a hand or spoke a word of greeting. They simply flowed around Silas and Faith like water around stones, keeping a careful distance, avoiding even accidental contact. Martha Perkins stood near the door, surrounded by her usual circle of women. As Faith approached, Martha turned her back, deliberately, completely, as if Faith had ceased to exist. The message was clear. Outside, the sun was too bright, the air was too warm. Silas squinted against the glare and guided Faith toward the buckboard. His hand hovering at her elbow without quite touching, they climbed onto the seat. He took up the reins. The horse began to move. 1 mile passed in silence. Then 2. Faith stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. Her jaw was clenched so tight that the muscle jumped beneath the skin of her cheek. The handkerchief she had carried into the church was now twisted into a tight spiral between her fingers. 3 miles. There's something you haven't told me. Her voice was flat, steady, the voice of someone who had already guessed the answer and simply needed confirmation. Silas's hands tightened on the reins. The leather creaked against his palms. The robbery, he said. There's a man named Jenkins. Old, half-blind. He's telling folks he saw a woman talking to strangers outside town the night before it happened. Faith did not move. He says it was you? The buckboard rolled on. The wheels crunched over gravel and dirt. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass, its song bright and oblivious. Faith's face had gone pale, not gradually, but all at once, as if the blood had simply drained away. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. I haven't been to town except that one time with you. I know. 2 words. He said them without hesitation. Without qualification, they hung in the air between them, simple and solid as stones. Faith turned to look at him. Her eyes searched his face for doubt, maybe, or accusation. She found neither. You believe me? I do. She faced forward again. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Her hands unclenched in her lap, the twisted handkerchief falling loose against her skirt. They did not speak again until the cabin appeared on the horizon. That night, Faith sat on the porch until the stars came out. Silas watched her through the window. She had not eaten supper, had not spoken since they returned from church. She simply sat in the old rocking chair, his mother's chair, and stared out at the darkening valley. He found the wool blanket in the chest by the fireplace, the one his mother had made. Frayed at the edges now, but still warm, still carrying the faint smell of cedar from the chest where it had been stored. He walked outside. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. Faith did not turn. He draped the blanket over her shoulders without a word, let it settle around her. Then he turned to go back inside. Silas. He stopped, one hand on the door frame. Why do you believe me? The question hung between them. Crickets sang in the grass, somewhere far off. A coyote yipped once and fell silent. Silas did not turn around. He spoke to the darkness beyond the porch rail, his voice rough and low. "Ain't nobody who darns socks like you got robbery in 'em." He heard her breath catch, a small sound, barely audible. Then he went inside and pulled the door closed behind him, gently, without looking back. He stood at the kitchen window, hands braced against the counter, staring out at the porch. The lamp behind him cast his reflection on the glass, a dark shape, featureless, blurred around the edges. Beyond it, he could see the rocking chair, the pale shape of Faith wrapped in the blanket. Her shoulders were shaking, not violently, not with the convulsive sobs of someone who had lost control, just a small, rhythmic trembling, a movement so subtle he might have missed it if he had not been watching so closely. She made no sound, no crying, no weeping, just that silent shaking in the darkness. Alone on the porch of a stranger's cabin, 4 weeks away from everything she had known and everyone who might have loved her. Silas's hands curled into fists against the counter. His knuckles went white. His jaw ached from clenching. He wanted to go back out there, wanted to sit beside her and say something, anything, that might ease the weight pressing down on her shoulders. But he did not know what to say, had never known. Words had always felt clumsy in his mouth, ill-fitting and wrong. So he stayed at the window, watching, waiting. The shaking continued for a long time. Then, slowly, it stilled. Faith pulled the blanket tighter around herself and lifted her face toward the sky. The starlight caught the wet tracks on her cheeks before she wiped them away with the back of her hand. She sat there a while longer. Then she rose, folded the blanket over her arm, and walked inside. She did not look at him as she passed through the kitchen, did not speak, just walked to the small room he had given her and closed the door behind her. The cabin fell silent. Silas stood alone in the darkness, the taste of cold coffee still on his tongue. The image of her shaking shoulders burned into his mind. She had cried tonight, for the first time since he found her on that muddy road. But she had not cried because they accused her. She had not cried because the town turned its back. She had cried because someone believed her. And that thought cracked something open in his chest that he did not know how to close. Tuesday morning, the sound of heavy hooves on packed earth brought Silas to the porch. A single rider approached, big man on a gray horse, tin star glinting on his chest. Sheriff Harlan, 60 years old, face carved from granite, eyes the color of winter slate. He did not hurry, did not need to. Authority moved at its own pace. Silas stepped down from the porch. His hands hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his back had gone tight. Harlan reined in his horse and dismounted. He looped the reins over the fence rail, taking his time, letting the silence stretch. Then he turned and looked past Silas toward the cabin door. Faith stood there. She had come out when she heard the horse. Her apron was still tied around her waist, flour dusting her forearms from the bread she had been kneading. "Morning, Sheriff." Harlan touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." His voice was polite, cold, the voice of a man who had learned to keep his opinions locked behind his teeth. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Faith wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course." They stood in the yard. Faith, Silas, and the sheriff, while the morning sun climbed higher and the chickens scratched in the dirt by the barn. Harlan pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket, licked the tip of his pencil. "When did you arrive in Willow Creek?" 5 weeks ago, the 16th of September. Where were you before that? Cincinnati. I worked at the Morrison textile mill for 3 years. Anyone here who can vouch for your whereabouts before you came to town? Faith's jaw tightened. I have letters. From the man who was supposed to meet me at the depot. 3 months of correspondence. Mind if I see them? She hesitated. Silas saw her fingers curl against her palms, nails digging into flesh. Then she walked inside and returned with the few letters she had kept, the ones that had not burned. The ones she needed as proof that she had not invented her story. Harlan took them. Flipped through the pages with the practiced speed of a man who had read 1,000 confessions. His face revealed nothing. He handed them back. These don't prove where you were the night before the robbery. Faith's chin lifted. I was here, in this cabin. Ask Silas. Harlan turned his slate-gray eyes toward Silas. Waited. She was here, Silas said. All night. I would have heard if she left. The sheriff wrote something in his notebook. Closed it. Tucked it back into his pocket. I ain't made up my mind yet. He mounted his horse, gathered the reins, and he looked down at Silas with an expression that might have been warning or might have been pity. Don't leave the county until this is sorted. Either of you. He paused. And if I was you, I'd sleep with one eye open. He rode away without looking back. Faith stood frozen in the yard. The letters clutched against her chest. Her face had gone the color of ash. Midnight. Silas woke to the sound of movement in the front room. He lay still, listening. Floorboards creaked. Something scraped wood against wood, the soft thump of fabric hitting the floor. He rose from his bed and walked barefoot down the hall. Faith knelt beside her valise. The lid was open. Clothes spilled across the floor, the blue calico dress, the white cotton nightgown, the shawl she had worn on the journey from Ohio. She was stuffing them back in, hands moving fast and clumsy, fingers trembling. What are you doing? She did not turn around. Her shoulders hunched forward, spine curved like someone expecting a blow. I have to leave. Why? You heard him. He thinks I did it. The whole town thinks I did it. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her fist against her mouth, fighting for control. I cannot stay here and destroy everything you have. They will say you helped me. They will say you are part of it. They will take your land, your name, everything your family built. Silas crossed the room. 3 steps. 4. He stopped in the doorway, blocking it with his body. He did not speak, did not reach for her. Just stood there, Eva hanging at his sides, filling the frame with his presence. Faith looked up. Her eyes were red, wet. The lamp behind her cast her shadow long and thin across the floorboards. Move. He did not move. Please. The word came out broken, ragged. Please, I am trying to protect you. Don't need protecting. Yes, you do. She rose to her feet. The half-packed valise gaped open behind her, clothes spilling out like the contents of a life torn apart. You have lived here your whole life. This is your land, your home, your name. They will take it all away because of me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I am not worth that. I am not worth anything anymore. The words hung in the air, ugly, raw. The words of someone who had been stripped of everything dignity. Hope. The simple belief that they deserved to exist. Silas's jaw tightened. Sit down, he said. What? Sit down, at the table. I'll make coffee. 3 in the morning. The lamp burned low on the kitchen table, its flame guttering in the draft from the window. 2 cups of coffee sat between them, long gone cold. Faith stared at her hands. They lay flat on the wooden surface, palms down, fingers spread. She had stopped crying, had stopped shaking. Now she simply sat, empty and still, like a clock that had wound down and could not find the strength to start again. I used to believe everything happened for a reason. Her voice was barely above a whisper. My mother taught me that. She said the Lord had a plan for every soul, even when we couldn't see it. She laughed a small, bitter sound that held no joy. I believed her, even when she died, even when my father followed her a week later. I told myself there was a reason, a purpose. She lifted her eyes to meet his. But there is no purpose in this. A man writes letters full of lies. A woman walks 40 miles on a promise that was never real. A town decides she is guilty because they need someone to blame. Her voice hardened. Where is the reason in that? Where is the plan? Silas sat with his hands wrapped around his cup. The coffee had gone bitter and cold, but he did not notice. He thought about his mother, the way she used to sing while she cooked, the way she smelled of lavender and bread dough, the way she had coughed for 3 months straight before the blood came and did not stop. He thought about his father, a quiet man who worked the land with his hands and never raised his voice, who had walked into the barn one morning after burying his wife and never walked out the same. He thought about his brother, Thomas, 2 years older, the one who inherited everything when their parents died, the one who sold the cattle, sold the equipment, sold the land their father had cleared with his own 2 hands, who took the money and disappeared west, leaving Silas with nothing but the clothes on his back and the cabin their mother had been born in. I was 14 when they died. The words came out rough, rusty, like machinery that had not moved in years. Consumption took Mama first, then Papa. 3 weeks later, his heart just stopped. Faith's hands went still on the table. My brother sold everything. The horses, the plow, the 50 acres our daddy spent his whole life building. He left me with this cabin and a note that said, "Good luck." Silas stared into his cup. I was 14 years old, alone, with winter coming and nothing but a roof and my own 2 hands. The lamp flickered. Shadows jumped across the walls. I ain't trusted nobody since. Not a neighbor, not a friend, not a soul in that town. He looked up, met her eyes across the table. Not until you showed up soaking wet on that road. Faith did not move, did not breathe. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full, full of things neither of them knew how to say. You believe in reasons, Silas said. His voice was low, steady. Maybe this is one. Maybe you ended up here because somebody needed to remember that not everybody leaves. He pushed back his chair and stood. His bones ached. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. The spare room is yours, long as you want it. I don't care what Harlan thinks. I don't care what the town thinks. He walked toward the door, then stopped at the threshold, turned back one last time. You stay or you go. That's your choice. But don't you dare leave because you think you're saving me. He went to his room and closed the door. He lay in the darkness, listening to the silence of the cabin, the creak of the settling walls, the distant call of a night bird, then footsteps, soft, crossing from the kitchen to the spare room, the click of a door closing. She had stayed, but even as something loosened in his chest, another thought surfaced. Cold, unwelcome. Harlan had not believed her. Harlan was still looking, and somewhere in Willow Creek, old Jenkins was still running his mouth, spreading poison with every breath. This was not over. It was only beginning. 2 weeks crawled by like wounded animals. Faith stopped talking about leaving. She cooked, she cleaned. She tended the flowers she had planted by the porch steps, marigolds and morning glories that had begun to push green shoots through the dry earth. But the lightness had gone out of her movements. She worked like someone serving a sentence, waiting for the next blow to fall. Silas watched. He did not know what else to do. The town had gone quiet. No more visits from Wilbur the mail carrier. No more warnings from Pete at the saloon. Even the rumors seemed to have paused, holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Then, on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Faith arrived, the sound of hooves brought them both to the porch. Sheriff Harlan rode up the path. Same gray horse, same tin star, same granite face, but something was different. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying a weight he had not expected. He did not loop the reins over the fence. Instead, he held them loose in his hands, standing in the yard, looking at Faith with an expression Silas had never seen on him before. "Ma'am." He removed his hat, held it against his chest. "I come to tell you something." Faith stood on the porch, hands clasped in front of her apron. Her face revealed nothing. "We caught the men who robbed the bank. 4 of them. They were holed up in Ridgewater, 50 miles south. Got caught trying to rob the general store there. The local sheriff wired us 2 days ago." Silas felt something shift in his chest. A knot he had not known was there began to loosen. "They confessed to the Willow Creek job. All of it. Named the date, the amount, the route they took out of town." Harlan's voice was steady, but his eyes kept dropping to the hat in his hands. "There was no woman with them. Not one. They worked alone." Faith did not move, did not speak. Jenkins was wrong. The woman he saw, turns out she was the wife of one of the robbers, passing through on her way to meet them. But she's got yellow hair, blonde as corn silk. He paused. "Nothing like yours." The silence stretched. A meadowlark called from the fence post. The wind stirred the dust at their feet. Harlan looked up, met Faith's eyes directly for the first time since he had arrived. "Miss Faith, I owe you an apology. We was wrong. I was wrong." He said it simply. No excuses, no explanations, just the bare words, laid out in the morning air. Faith looked at him. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She did not smile, did not soften, did not offer the comfort of easy forgiveness. "Thank you for telling me." 4 words, nothing more. Harlan nodded once. He understood. Some wounds did not heal with a single sorry. Some debts took longer to pay. He mounted his horse, settled his hat back on his head, and turned toward the road. Before he kicked into a trot, he glanced back at Silas. "You were right about her. I should have listened." Then he was gone, the gray horse carrying him back toward town, dust rising in his wake. Silas stood on the porch, watching until the rider disappeared around the bend. His hands hung at his sides. He did not know what to do with them. Faith had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been, staring at the empty road, her face unreadable. Silas stepped closer. His hand moved without his permission, reached out and touched her elbow. Just for a second. Just enough to let her know he was there. She did not pull away. Then his hand dropped back to his side, and they stood together in the silence, watching the dust settle on the road that had brought them both so much trouble. The visitors started coming 3 days later. Martha Perkins was the first. She arrived in a buckboard, wearing her Sunday dress on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a covered dish balanced on her lap. Her face was redder than usual. Her eyes kept darting away, unable to hold Faith's gaze for more than a second. Faith met her in the yard. "I brought pie." Martha thrust the dish forward like a shield. "Apple. Made it this morning." Faith took the dish, and the tin was still warm through the cloth covering. "I should have—" Martha's voice trailed off. She twisted her hands together, fingers knotting and unknotting. "Well, you know." Faith looked at the pie, looked at Martha. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Thank you, Martha." 3 words. Polite, distant. The voice of a woman accepting a gift without accepting the apology behind it. Martha's face reddened further. She nodded quickly, climbed back into her buckboard, and drove away without another word. Faith carried the pie inside. She set it on the table, lifted the cloth, and studied the golden crust for a long moment. Then she cut 2 slices, one for her, one for Silas, and they ate it without speaking. It was good pie. But Faith did not smile. The preacher came on Saturday. Reverend Hollis, a thin man with kind eyes and a voice like warm honey, walked up the path with his Bible tucked under his arm. "Miss Faith? Mr. Silas?" He nodded to each of them in turn. "I wanted to personally invite you back to services tomorrow. You would be most welcome." Faith stood on the porch steps, a watering can in her hand. The marigolds beside the railing had begun to bloom small bursts of gold against the weathered wood. "That's kind of you, Reverend. I know things have been difficult." He chose his words carefully, like a man crossing a creek on stepping stones. "The congregation has asked me to extend their regrets. Many of them feel they acted hastily." Faith set down the watering can. She wiped her hands on her apron, taking her time. "Do they?" It was not a question. Reverend Hollis had the grace to look uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the Bible pressed tight against his chest. "We are all imperfect, Miss Faith. We stumble. We fall. We hurt those we should have helped." He paused. "But we can also rise. We can also mend." Faith looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the watering can and turned back to her flowers. "I will think about it, Reverend." He nodded, touched his hat, walked away. Silas watched him go from the barn doorway, a bridle hanging forgotten in his hands. Jenkins did not come. The letter arrived 5 days after the sheriff's visit, delivered by young Tommy Porter, who ran errands for the general store. It was written on brown paper in handwriting so shaky it barely qualified as words. Faith read it at the kitchen table while Silas pretended to work on a harness that did not need mending. "My eyes ain't what they used to be." She read the words aloud, her voice flat. "I seen what I thought I seen, but I seen wrong. I am sorry for the trouble." She paused. "Ezra Jenkins." She folded the letter along its original creases, smoothed the edges with her fingertips. Silas waited. "He did not come himself," she said. "He sent a piece of paper. He's 70 years old. Knees are bad. His knees were not too bad to stand at the general store and tell everyone I was a thief. Silas had no answer for that. Faith sat with the letter in her hands, staring at the crooked letters, the ink blots, the trembling signature at the bottom. An old man's handwriting, an old man's excuse. She rose from the table, walked to the chest by the fireplace where she kept her few possessions, opened the lid. Silas expected her to throw the letter in the fire. It would have been justified. It would have been deserved. Instead, she placed it inside the chest, closed the lid, straightened up. "I am not ready to forgive him," she said, "but I am not ready to burn it either." She walked to the stove and began preparing supper. Silas sat in his chair, the useless harness still in his lap, watching her move through the kitchen, the way she reached for the salt, the way she stirred the pot, the way she hummed a tune under her breath, soft and low, barely audible. But there, she had not hummed since the church, since the silence and the turned backs and the weight of a town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Now she hummed again. It was not forgiveness. It was not healing. It was just a woman making supper, humming a half-remembered song, moving through the motions of ordinary life. But it was enough. Silas looked out the window toward the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The marigolds by the porch glowed like small flames in the fading light. Tomorrow, the townspeople might come again with more apologies, more pies, more awkward words. Or they might not. Some of them never would. It did not matter. What mattered was the sound of Faith humming in the kitchen, the smell of beans and cornbread, the quiet creak of the cabin settling into evening. What mattered was that she had stayed, and somewhere in the silence between them, something new had taken root, something that felt like the beginning of home. 3 months. The marigolds had exploded into riots of gold and orange along the porch rail. Morning glories climbed the posts in spirals of purple and blue, their trumpet flowers opening each dawn to greet the sun. The second bloom was even stronger than the first. Faith had learned which spots got the best light, which soil held water longest. The cabin wore new curtains now, calico with tiny yellow flowers that Faith had sewn from fabric bought on their last trip to town. The windows gleamed. The floors no longer creaked with dust and neglect. Even the old rocking chair on the porch had been oiled and mended, its runners smooth and silent. Silas sat on the porch bench, watching the evening light stretch long across the valley. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth and something else, something that had not been here before Faith came. Cornbread. Always cornbread now. Every morning, Faith moved in the kitchen behind him. He could hear the soft clink of dishes, the slosh of water in the basin, the creak of floorboards under her feet. Sounds he had memorized without meaning to. Sounds that had become the rhythm of his days. He did not pretend to work anymore, did not find excuses to be in the barn or by the fence when she was outside. He just sat and watched. And she knew he watched. And neither of them spoke about it. The screen door creaked open. Faith stepped onto the porch, drying her hands on a cotton towel. She had let her hair down tonight, something she rarely did, and it fell past her shoulders in soft waves, catching the last copper light of sunset. She sat beside him on the bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I have been thinking," she said. Silas waited. "About the man who was supposed to meet me, James Hollister." She spoke the name without flinching now. It had lost its power somewhere in the past weeks, become just a word, just a collection of letters that no longer cut. I used to wonder why he did it, why he wrote those letters, why he made promises he never intended to keep. The valley stretched before them, golden grass bending in the evening breeze. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermals, patient and unhurried. Do you still wonder? Faith shook her head slowly. No, not anymore. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were clear, steady. The haunted look that had lived behind them for so long had faded, not vanished, but softened, like an old scar that no longer ached when the weather changed. If he had come, she said, I would be living in town, in a house with a white fence and a man who lied to me before I ever met him. She paused. I would not be here. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. He looked away toward the horizon, where the sun was melting into the ridge. Reckon not. Faith smiled, just barely, just at the corners of her mouth. I think I got the better end of the bargain. After supper, Faith did something she had not done in months. She pulled the valise from the corner of the front room and carried it to the kitchen table. The leather was worn now, scuffed at the corners, the brass clasp tarnished to a dull brown. It had traveled 2,000 miles and survived more than any piece of luggage should have to. Silas watched from the doorway as she unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, a few items remained. The letters she had kept as proof, the ones that had not burned that first night. James Hollister's words, written in careful script on cream-colored paper. 3 months of lies tied with kitchen string. Faith lifted them out, held them in her lap for a long moment. The fire crackled in the stove. The lamp cast warm shadows across the walls. Outside, crickets had begun their evening chorus, filling the darkness with sound. Faith rose from the table, walked to the stove, opened the iron door. She fed the letters into the flames one by one. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash. All those careful words, all those empty promises consumed in seconds. The kitchen filled with the smell of burning paper, sharp and clean. She stood there until the last letter had burned, until nothing remained but gray flakes settling among the coals. Then she closed the stove door and returned to the table. Silas had not moved from the doorway. He watched her reach into her apron pocket and pull out 3 small objects. A handkerchief, worn thin at the edges, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft as silk. The one he had given her that first night, when she sat shivering by the fire. A marigold, pressed flat and dry between 2 pieces of paper. Its petals faded to the color of old honey. From the first bloom in the garden she had planted, a scrap of paper. Folded small, she opened it and smoothed it flat on the table. One word written in her careful hand. Home. She placed all 3 items in the valise, closed the lid, latched the clasp. The same valise she had clutched on the roadside in the rain, the same valise that had held everything she owned, everything she had brought from Ohio, everything she had hoped her new life would contain. Now it held something different. Silas cleared his throat. What are you doing? Faith looked up at him. The lamplight caught the shine in her eyes, but she was smiling. Starting over. Later. They sat on the porch as the stars came out. The bench was narrow. Their shoulders touched now, not almost, but actually. A warm pressure through the fabric of their sleeves. Neither of them moved away. The night air carried the smell of sage and distant rain, Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called. Another answered from the ridge. The sounds wove together, ancient and familiar. Part of a conversation, and that had been happening long before either of them was born. Silas. I never asked you something. He waited. That first night, when you found me on the road. She paused. Why did you stop? The question hung in the air between them. He had asked himself the same thing 100 times in the months since. Had never found an answer that satisfied. Don't know, he said finally. Just did. Faith nodded slowly. That is what I thought. She leaned back against the bench, her head tilting until it rested against his shoulder. Light as a bird, natural as breathing. My mother used to say that Providence sends people into our lives exactly when we need them. Not a moment sooner, not a moment later. Her voice was soft, thoughtful. I used to think she was being sentimental. And now, Faith turned her face toward his. In the starlight, her eyes were deep and dark, holding something he could not name. Now I think she might have been right. Silas did not answer, did not know how. He had spent so many years alone, building walls of silence around himself, that the words felt strange in his mouth, too big, too clumsy, too likely to come out wrong. So he did not speak. Instead, he let his hand move across the worn wood of the bench, slowly, carefully, until his fingers found hers. She did not pull away. They sat like that as the stars wheeled overhead. Two people who had been abandoned by the world, who had found each other on a muddy road in the rain, who had learned to trust again in the quiet spaces between words. The cabin stood behind them, warm and solid, its windows glowing with lamplight. The marigolds nodded in the night breeze. The valley stretched away into darkness, vast and unknowable, full of dangers they could not predict and sorrows they could not prevent. But here, on this porch, in this moment, there was peace. Faith's fingers tightened around his, a small pressure, a silent answer to a question he had not known he was asking. Silas looked out at the stars, at the valley, at the road that curved away toward town, toward the world that had judged them both and found them wanting. He did not care about any of it anymore. What mattered was here. What mattered was the woman beside him, her hand in his, her breath steady and calm in the darkness. What mattered was the home they had built together, not with grand gestures or spoken vows, but with cornbread and mended shirts and flowers planted in stubborn soil. He squeezed her hand back, and the night wrapped around them, gentle and quiet, like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. Far below in the valley, a light flickered in a distant farmhouse window. A dog barked once and fell silent. The wind stirred the tall grass, making it whisper. Above the ridge, the first clouds of autumn gathered on the horizon, carrying the smell of change. Faith lifted her face to the sky, the stars reflected in her eyes. It is going to rain tomorrow, she said. Silas looked at the clouds, nodded. Reckon so. She smiled, that small, quiet smile he had come to treasure. Good. The garden needs it. She rose from the bench, her hand slipping from his, walked to the door, paused with her fingers on the handle. Good night, Silas. Night, Faith. She went inside. The screen door closed behind her with a soft click. Silas sat alone on the porch, listening to her footsteps cross the kitchen, the creak of her bedroom door, the settling silence of the cabin. He stayed there a long time, watching the stars, feeling the space on the bench where she had been. It did not feel empty anymore. It felt like waiting, like the pause between one breath and the next, like home. There is a quiet that settles after a story like this one. Something tender sits in the chest, not quite sadness, not quite joy, just a fullness that does not need a name. Many of us have stood where faith stood, on a road we did not expect, holding something that no longer meant what it once did. Some of us have been Silas, too living so long in silence that we forgot what it sounded like to have someone else breathing in the next room, carrying a hurt we never spoke aloud, building walls we told ourselves were necessary. And perhaps you have known what it is to be believed when the world had already made up its mind, or to believe someone when believing was the harder choice. These things stay with us. They do not need to be explained or resolved. It is all right if something in this story did not settle neatly. Some things are allowed to rest unfinished, held gently in whatever corner of the heart still has room. It is enough that you stayed. It is enough that you listened. Thank you for being here tonight, for letting this story sit beside you in the quiet. May your evening be peaceful, friend.